"Get out of the way," shouted the millionaire as she drove through the mud puddle. But what happens next is shocking. Victoria Richards was in a hurry that rainy Tuesday morning. Her schedule was packed with important meetings that could determine the future of her construction company, one of the largest in upstate New York. At 35, she had inherited the business from her father and turned it into an empire. But it came at a price she didn't yet realize. That's when she spotted the woman walking slowly along the dirt road leading to the city center. Victoria honked impatiently and shouted out the window of her black Lexus, "Get out of the way!" Without hesitation, she deliberately sped through the enormous mud puddle formed by the overnight rain. The muddy water splashed everywhere, completely drenching the figure in white, carrying a lunchbox in her hands. Laughing loudly, Victoria glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the woman standing still, covered in mud, clutching the lunchbox like a treasure. She couldn't care less. She had more important things to do than worry about people who chose to walk on a dirt road. The woman left behind was named Ruth Wilson, 52 years old, and had worked as a seamstress for over 3 decades. That morning, she was on her way to visit her mother, Dorothy, who had been hospitalized for a week at Mercy Memorial Hospital with pneumonia that wasn't improving. The lunchbox she carried held the oatmeal her mother loved so much, made with care in the early hours of the morning. Ruth looked down at her white dress, now completely brown with mud, and felt tears mixing with the raindrops still falling. It wasn't just the ruined clothes that upset her, it was the humiliation, the feeling of being invisible to people like that woman in the expensive car. But Ruth wasn't one to give up. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and kept walking toward the hospital. When she reached the reception desk at Mercy Memorial Hospital, the security guard looked her up and down with disapproval. "You can't go in like that," he said, crossing his arms. "You're filthy. You could contaminate the patients." "Please, sir," Ruth pleaded. "I'm just here to see my mother. She's in room 308. I brought her favorite oatmeal." "I can't make exceptions. The rules are clear. You'll have to come back another day clean and presentable." Ruth felt her world collapse. Her mother had been waiting days for this visit. Dorothy had been a widow for 8 years, and Ruth was all she had left in the world. Unable to hold back her tears, Ruth sat on the curb outside the hospital, clutching the lunchbox to her chest. The rain had stopped, but she was still wet and cold. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Just then, a nurse getting off her night shift noticed Ruth sitting there crying. Sarah Johnson, 48, was known at the hospital for her kindness and dedication to patients. She approached slowly and asked, "What happened, Mom?" Ruth explained between sobs. Sarah looked at that weary face, and something stirred in her heart. There was something familiar about this woman, but she couldn't place it. "Come with me," Sarah said. "I'll help you clean up, and you can see your mother." Sarah took Ruth to the staff locker room and lent her a clean uniform. As Ruth changed, the nurse couldn't stop staring at her. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. "Wait a minute," Sarah said, her eyes widening. "You're Ruth Wilson, aren't you? The seamstress from Oakwood Heights?" "Yes," Ruth replied, surprised. "How do you know me?" "I've worked here for 15 years. You saved a patient's life back in 2018. She donated blood when we urgently needed it. Her blood type is very rare, AB negative. The patient had been given up for hope, and you were the only compatible donor we found." Ruth vaguely remembered. It was common for her to donate blood when the hospital needed it. She never asked who, for, or why. She simply did it because she believed it was right to help. "The woman whose life you saved," Sarah continued, "is still here. She's been here for 6 months in the premium wing. She's an elderly woman, Mrs. Eleanor Richards. The family has a lot of money, but she's practically abandoned. Her daughter only shows up to pay the bills." The surname Richards made Ruth remember the license plate she saw on the car that had splashed her. Could it be a coincidence? In a small town like Fairfield, maybe it wasn't so unlikely. After visiting her mother and dropping off the porridge, Ruth couldn't stop thinking about the story Sarah had told. Mrs. Eleanor, the woman she had saved, had been alone for months. Her own mother constantly complained about loneliness in the hospital. What must it be like to be abandoned by your own daughter? The next day, Ruth returned to the hospital to see her mother again. This time she was clean and tidy, but she brought an extra meal. After visiting Dorothy, she asked Sarah if she could meet Mrs. Eleanor. Of course, the nurse said. She's very lonely. She'll be happy for the visit. Ruth knocked on the door of room 415 in the premium wing. "Come in," a weak voice called from inside. Mrs. Eleanor Richards was 73 years old and an elegant woman, even lying in a hospital bed. Her grey hair was neatly styled and she wore an expensive silk nightgown, but her eyes revealed deep sadness. "Who are you?" Mrs. Eleanor asked curiously. "My name is Ruth. I heard you were here alone and thought you might like some company." Ruth sat in the chair beside the bed, and the two began to talk. She learned that Mrs. Eleanor had only one daughter, Victoria, who had become very cold after her husband, William Richards, passed away 5 years earlier. "She changed completely," Mrs. Eleanor said, her eyes brimming with tears. "She used to be affectionate, always calling me, visiting me. After she inherited her father's company, she became a different person. All she thinks about now is money and business." "Does she visit you?" Ruth asked, already suspecting the answer. "Sometimes she stops by, but never stays more than 10 minutes. Always in a hurry, always with her phone in hand. I've been here 6 months and she's only come to see me 3 times. Ruth felt a pang in her chest. How could a daughter abandon her own mother like that? She decided then and there that she would come back every day to keep the elderly woman company. Over the following weeks, Ruth settled into a routine. She visited her mother in the morning and spent a few hours with Mrs. Eleanor in the afternoon. She brought homemade food, told stories, and listened to the older woman's memories of better times. Mrs. Eleanor began to show visible improvements in her mood and even her health. It was during one of these conversations that Mrs. Eleanor revealed something that left Ruth in shock. "Ruth, I need to tell you something," the elderly woman said, holding the seamstress's hand. "Victoria is planning to sell our house in Oakwood Heights, the house where she grew up, where William built our dreams. She says it's just an unproductive investment and that she needs the money to expand the company." Ruth knew that house well. It was one of the most beautiful in Oakwood Heights, where she herself lived. A yellow house with a garden full of roses, always catching the eye of passers-by. "That house holds so many memories," Mrs. Eleanor continued. "It's where Victoria took her first steps, where we celebrated all her birthdays, where William proposed to me. How can she want to sell all of that?" Ruth didn't know what to say. With each passing day, the image Victoria Richards formed of herself grew worse. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, Victoria finally showed up to visit her mother. Ruth happened to be there during visiting hours, helping Mrs. Eleanor Richards eat a piece of cornbread cake she had made especially for her. Victoria stormed into the room like a hurricane, loudly talking on her phone about contracts and deadlines. When she saw Ruth, she stopped mid-sentence and stared at her in shock. "Mom, who is this woman?" Victoria asked, hanging up the phone. "This is Ruth, my dear friend," Mrs. Eleanor replied warmly. "She visits me every day. She's the daughter I always dreamed of having." Her mother's words hit Victoria like a punch to the gut. She studied Ruth more closely, a strange sense of familiarity nagging at her, though she couldn't place why. "I don't think it's appropriate for strangers to be here," Victoria said coldly. "Mom, you don't know this woman's intentions." Ruth stood up, sensing the hostility in the air. "I'll let you two talk," she said. "Mrs. Richards, I'll be back tomorrow." After Ruth left, Mrs. Eleanor looked at her daughter with an expression Victoria hadn't seen in years: disappointment. "Victoria, what a bitter woman you've become," the elderly woman said, her voice trembling. "Ruth has taken care of me with more kindness than you ever have. She brings me food, spends hours talking with me, makes me laugh. When was the last time you did any of that?" "Mom, I work. I have responsibilities. I can't be here all day," Victoria retorted, but for the first time, she felt a weight on her conscience. "Responsibilities more important than your own mother?" Mrs. Eleanor asked. "Your father would never have let business become more important than family." Victoria left the hospital that day with an uneasy feeling. She was used to controlling everything in her life, but here was something slipping through her grasp. And worse, There was a stranger taking the place that should have been hers in her mother's life. That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. She kept replaying her mother's words, the affectionate look in her eyes when she spoke of Ruth. When was the last time someone had looked at her with such warmth? When was the last time she had shown affection to anyone? She decided to investigate who this Ruth Wilson was. She hired a private detective to uncover everything about the seamstress's life. What she discovered left her even more unsettled. Ruth Wilson, 52 years old, widowed for 10 years, worked as a seamstress and cleaned offices overnight to make ends meet. She had raised a daughter, Emily, on her own, now a nurse living in New York City. Ruth had no criminal record. In fact, she was known in the community for her generosity. She donated blood regularly, helped neighbors in need, and looked after neighborhood children when necessary. The detective's report mentioned something that caught Victoria's attention. Ruth had donated blood for a patient at Mercy Memorial Hospital in 2018, saving their life. The patient was described only as an elderly woman in the premium wing. A chill ran down Victoria's spine. Could it be that Ruth had saved her mother's life without her even knowing? She decided to confront Sarah, the nurse overseeing her mother's care. "It's true," Sarah confirmed. "Your mother had severe internal bleeding after surgery in 2018. We urgently needed AB negative blood. Ruth was the only compatible donor we could find. She saved your mother's life." Victoria was stunned. The woman she had seen as an intruder had literally saved her mother's life. And how had she repaid her? By treating her like an inconvenient stranger. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the following days, Victoria began observing Ruth from a distance. She discovered that the seamstress arrived at the hospital every day at 2 in the afternoon, always carrying something: food, flowers, a book, or simply a smile. She stayed with her mother until 5 in the afternoon, then went to visit her own mother on the floor below. Victoria decided to follow Ruth one day to better understand who this woman was. She watched as Ruth left the hospital and walked to the bus stop. It was the same dirt road where Victoria had deliberately driven through the mud puddle weeks earlier. The realization hit her like lightning. Ruth was the woman she had drenched in mud that morning, the woman in white carrying a lunchbox, whom she had humiliated without a second thought. Victoria felt her stomach twist. She had humiliated the very person who had saved her mother's life and was now caring for her with the love she herself should have been giving. That revelation changed something deep within Victoria. For the first time in years, she saw herself as she truly was, a cold, selfish, and cruel person. Her professional success had cost her humanity. Victoria began rethinking all her priorities. She cancelled meetings to spend more time at the hospital, but whenever she arrived, Ruth was already there, doing exactly what she should have been doing, taking care of her mother. One day, Victoria decided to arrive early to have some time alone with Mrs. Eleanor before Ruth showed up. She found her mother sleeping peacefully, with a smile on her face. On the bedside table was a photo she had never seen before. It was an old picture, yellowed with time, showing a young Mrs. Eleanor pregnant, standing next to William Richards in front of the yellow house in Oakwood Heights. But what caught Victoria's attention was something else. In the corner of the photo was a family. A man, a woman, and a little girl who seemed to be visiting her parents. Victoria picked up the photo to get a closer look. The girl in the picture had familiar features. Suddenly she recognized her. It was Ruth, much younger, maybe around 10 years old. When Ruth arrived for her afternoon visit, Victoria was waiting for her with the photo in hand. "Ruth, I need to talk to you," Victoria said, her tone different from usual. Ruth noticed the change in Victoria's behavior and braced herself for the worst. Maybe she would be forbidden from visiting Mrs. Eleanor. "I found this photo on my mother's table," Victoria said, showing her the image. "Can you explain who these people are?" Ruth looked at the photo and her eyes filled with tears. "That's my family," she said, her voice trembling. "My parents and me. I was 10 in this photo." "But why are you in my parents' house?" Victoria asked, confused. Ruth took a deep breath before answering. "My father had lost his job and we were struggling. We didn't even have money for food. Your mother heard about our situation and, without even knowing my family, offered to help. She gave us food, clothes, and even paid our rent for 3 months until my father found another job. Victoria felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. My mother helped your family. Your mother saved my family, Ruth corrected. Without her, I don't know what would have become of us. That's why, when I found out she was here alone, I didn't hesitate to return the kindness. Your mother is a wonderful person, Victoria. She speaks of you with so much pride, even knowing you don't have time for her. Victoria began to cry. She hadn't cried since her father's funeral. Here was proof that her mother had always been a generous and loving person, while she had become the exact opposite. Ruth, I need to tell you something, Victoria said through tears. I was the one who splashed mud on you that morning on the road. I was the one who humiliated you and kept you from seeing your mother clean. Ruth was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. I already knew, she said calmly. How did you already know? Asked Victoria, astonished. I recognized your car in the hospital parking lot on the second day I came to visit your mother. I remembered the license plate. In a small town like ours, there aren't many black Lexus cars like that. And why did you never confront me? Why did you keep coming here? Because your mother needed someone, Ruth replied simply. And I learned long ago that holding on to resentment only hurts the one who holds it. Besides, taking care of Mrs. Eleanor has been a pleasure for me. She reminds me of my own mother. Victoria was speechless. There before her was a lesson in humanity she never expected to receive. Ruth had not only forgiven her cruelty, but had continued doing good, even knowing who she was. At that moment, Mrs. Eleanor woke up and found the two women talking by her bedside. She smiled, as if she knew something important was happening. My daughter, Mrs. Eleanor said to Victoria, you've finally really met each other. Mom, did you know who Ruth was from the beginning? Victoria asked. Of course I knew, dear. I recognized her the first day she came to visit. Ruth Wilson, the girl I helped so many years ago. She grew up and became a wonderful woman, full of kindness and gratitude. Victoria realized her mother had orchestrated everything from the start. She knew letting Ruth care for her would be a way to teach her daughter a lesson about what truly mattered in life. From that day on, Victoria began to rethink her entire existence. She cancelled the sale of the house in Oakwood Heights and decided to turn it into a special project. With Ruth's help, she created a temporary home for elderly people who were alone or abandoned by their families. Victoria also changed her routine at the hospital. She started sharing visiting time with Ruth, and the two developed an unlikely but genuine friendship. Ruth taught Victoria how to make Mrs. Eleanor's favorite dishes, while Victoria helped Ruth sort out the financial situation of her own mother, who also needed expensive medical care. 3 months later, Mrs. Dorothy, Ruth's mother, was discharged from the hospital. Her pneumonia had been cured, and she was stronger. Mrs. Eleanor was also doing better, both physically and emotionally. The love and attention she received daily had worked miracles on her health. One day, Mrs. Eleanor called Victoria and Ruth for a serious conversation. Girls, I want to talk about the future, the elderly woman said. I won't live forever, and when my time comes, I want to make sure the two of you stay united. Mom, don't talk like that, Victoria protested. It's necessary, dear, and I want you both to know these last few months have been the happiest of my life in the past 5 years. You two have given me back the joy of living. Mrs. Eleanor then revealed something that surprised them both. I've already changed my will. Half of my estate will go to Victoria, as I always planned, but the other half will go toward expanding the elderly home project. Ruth, I want you to oversee that part. Mrs. Eleanor, I can't accept that, Ruth protested. You can and you will, the elderly woman said firmly. You've given me more in 3 months than many people give in a lifetime. This is my way of giving back and ensuring other lonely people like me get the same kindness you've shown me. Victoria was moved by her mother's decision. It was the final proof that Mrs. Eleanor had found in Ruth not just a friend, but truly a second daughter. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing, 6 months later, Mrs. Eleanor had a relapse. Her advanced age and heart problems left her very frail. Victoria and Ruth took turns staying by her side day and night. One Sunday morning, Mrs. Eleanor asked to speak with each of them alone. First, she called Ruth. "Ruth, my dear heart's daughter," the elderly woman said, gripping her hands tightly. "I want to thank you for showing me that kindness still exists in this world. You taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, care, and presence." Ruth was crying, knowing these might be her last moments with the woman she had come to love like a second mother. "You taught me so much too, Mrs. Eleanor," Ruth said. "You taught me that forgiving means freeing yourself, and that true love always finds a way to grow." Then it was Victoria's turn. "My daughter," Mrs. Eleanor said, "you lost your way after your father passed, but you found your way back. I'm so proud of the woman you've become these past few months." "Mom, forgive me for being such a terrible daughter," Victoria sobbed. "You were never a terrible daughter, my dear. You were just lost. But Ruth helped you find yourself, just as she helped me find joy again." Mrs. Eleanor lived for 3 more months, surrounded by the love of the 2 women who had become her daughters. Her final days were filled with conversations, laughter, and many fond memories. She passed peacefully on a Thursday morning, holding Victoria's and Ruth's hands. On the day of the funeral, all of Oakwood Heights came to pay their respects. Mrs. Eleanor was remembered as a generous woman who had helped many families throughout her life. Through the shared stories, Victoria discovered her mother had done far more good than she ever realized. After the funeral, Victoria and Ruth took care of Mrs. Eleanor's final wishes. Beyond the distribution of her estate as outlined in the will, there was one last surprise: a box of letters the elderly woman had written in her final months. There was one for each of them. In Ruth's letter, Mrs. Eleanor had written, "My dear Ruth, you came into my life like an angel when I needed it most. You restored my faith in human kindness and taught me that even the greatest cruelties can be forgiven. Take care of Victoria. She's a good person who simply lost her way. And always remember, you're not just a seamstress, you're a life seamstress. Thank you for stitching my life back together." In Victoria's letter, it read, "My beloved daughter, you are my greatest pride and my greatest work. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become these past months. Ruth taught you that true success isn't measured in money, but in how many lives you touch with love. Keep growing, keep learning, and never forget that family is where love is, not just where blood ties lie." The 2 women wept together as they read the letters. It was as if Mrs. Eleanor was still there, guiding their next steps. A year later, the Eleanor Richards home was operating in the old yellow house in Oakwood Heights. The place had been renovated to house 15 elderly residents who were alone or abandoned by their families. Ruth managed the home with Victoria's help, who had transformed her company into a permanent partner for the project. Victoria had completely changed her approach to work. She was still a successful businesswoman, but now part of her company's profits went to social initiatives. She had discovered that helping others gave life a meaning money never could. Ruth, in turn, had become a respected figure in the community. Besides running the senior home, she still visited lonely patients at the hospital and coordinated a group of volunteers who cared for the city's underprivileged. The friendship between Victoria and Ruth had deepened in the most beautiful way. They complemented each other, Victoria with her organizational skills and financial resources, Ruth with her experience in caring for people and her natural kindness. On a Saturday afternoon, exactly 2 years after the day Victoria had drenched Ruth in mud, the 2 were in the garden of the senior home, tending to the roses that Mrs. Eleanor had loved so much. "Ruth, can I ask you something?" said Victoria, pruning a bush. "Of course, go ahead." "Do you think your life would have been different if that day on the road hadn't happened?" Ruth stopped what she was doing and looked at Victoria with a smile. "You know what, Victoria? I believe everything in life happens for a reason. If you hadn't gotten me dirty that day, maybe I never would have met your mother. And if I hadn't met your mother, maybe you never would have found yourself again. So you don't hold a grudge about that day. On the contrary, I'm grateful for that day. It was the beginning of everything that brought us here." Victoria smiled and went back to tending the roses. Sometimes the worst situations can lead to the best destinations. That same afternoon, a new resident arrived at the home, Mrs. Margaret, a 78-year-old woman who had been abandoned by her children in a rundown public nursing home. Ruth welcomed her with the same warmth she had shown Mrs. Eleanor at the hospital. "Mrs. Margaret, welcome," said Ruth, helping the elderly woman settle into the room that would be her new home. "Here, you'll receive all the care you deserve." "No one has ever said that to me," replied Mrs. Margaret, her eyes filled with tears. "My children left me in that place and never came back." "It'll be different here," Ruth assured her. "Here, you have a new family." Victoria, who had been watching the scene, felt her heart tighten. How many Mrs. Margarets were there in the world? How many elderly people were being abandoned by families who only thought of themselves? She herself had almost been one of those people. At that moment, Victoria made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others. She decided she would expand the project to other cities, creating a network of homes for abandoned seniors across the state of New York. She sought out Ruth and shared her idea. "Ruth, I want to take our project to other cities. So many people need help." "It's a wonderful idea," Ruth replied, "but it'll take a lot of work and dedication." "I have both," said Victoria, "and I have you as my partner. Together, we can make a difference in hundreds of lives." 2 years later, the Eleanor Richards Care Network had 12 locations across upstate New York. Victoria had sold part of her construction company to fund the project, but she had never felt more professionally fulfilled. Ruth had become an expert in managing senior homes and traveled across the state training new coordinators. Her experience and sensitivity were key to the project's success. The two met once a month at the original Oakwood Heights location to review their work and, most importantly, to visit Mrs. Eleanor's grave and share their progress. "Mom," Victoria would say, placing fresh flowers on the grave, "the project has already sheltered over 200 seniors. You'd be so proud." "Mrs. Eleanor," Ruth would add, "you planted a seed of love that's now blooming in so many cities. Thank you for teaching us the true meaning of family." During one of these visits to the cemetery, Ruth told Victoria about a letter she had received. "Victoria, a very touching letter arrived last week. It was from Mr. George, one of the first residents of the original home. He managed to reconcile with his son after 3 years of not speaking." "How so?" asked Victoria, curious. "The son found out about the home through a news report on TV and was ashamed of having abandoned his father. He came to pick up Mr. George, and now they're living together again. Mr. George wrote a letter thanking us because it was at the home that he learned to forgive his son." Victoria smiled. That was exactly the kind of story Mrs. Eleanor would have loved to hear. "Ruth, there's something I want to do," Victoria said. "I want to create a special project within the network, a program that helps separated families reconcile." "How would it work?" "We could have psychologists and mediators working with the families, teaching them about forgiveness, communication, and rebuilding relationships. Often, people drift apart because of pride or hurt, but deep down they still love each other." Ruth thought the idea was wonderful. They began planning the project that same day, sitting on the bench Victoria had placed beside her mother's grave. The Reconnection Project, as it was called, started 6 months later. The first case was a daughter who had cut ties with her mother over an inheritance dispute 20 years earlier. Through family therapy sessions and open dialogue, they managed to reconcile. The daughter, a retired nurse, even decided to volunteer at the home, caring for other seniors. The project was such a success that it caught the attention of the national media. Victoria and Ruth were interviewed on several TV shows, sharing the story of the home and how it all began. During one of those interviews, Victoria was asked what had changed her life. "I learned that sometimes the most important things in life come disguised as the worst moments," she replied. "If I hadn't been cruel to Ruth that day, I might never have discovered who I could truly be." Ruth, in turn, was asked how she could forgive and help even those who had hurt her. "Forgiveness isn't a favor you do for the person who hurt you," she explained. "It's a gift you give yourself. When you forgive, you free yourself to live in peace and love." 5 years after it all began, Victoria and Ruth were celebrating the anniversary of the first home. Over 500 seniors had passed through the network's facilities, and many had reconciled with their families through the Reconnection project. During the celebration, Victoria gave an emotional speech to all the volunteers, staff and family members present. "When my mother passed, she left behind more than material possessions," Victoria said. "She left a legacy of love and forgiveness. Ruth taught me that family isn't just who you're born with, it's who chooses to stand by you. All of you are my family now." Ruth also spoke, with her usual simplicity. "I've learned that small acts of kindness can change entire lives. Every one of you who cares for a senior here is planting seeds of love that will bloom in other lives." At the end of the party, Victoria and Ruth sat in the garden, watching the seniors chatting and laughing with their caregivers. "Ruth, can I tell you a secret?" Victoria said. "Of course, go ahead." "When I was little, I always dreamed of having a sister. Now I know fate just took a little longer to introduce us." Ruth smiled and took Victoria's hand. "And I always wanted a daughter besides Emily. I think I gained both a daughter and a best friend at the same time." The two women sat there in silence watching the sunset. They were certain Mrs. Eleanor was watching over them, proud to see how a simple act of kindness had multiplied into so much love. 2 more years passed. The Eleanor Richards Care Network had expanded to other states, always upholding the same principles of love, respect, and dignity for seniors. The Reconnection project had become an independent program, with psychologists and mediators working in cities across the country. Victoria, now 42, had married Michael, a geriatric doctor she met during one of the network's events. They understood each other perfectly, united by their passion for caring for the elderly. Victoria was pregnant with her first daughter, who would be named Eleanor in honor of her grandmother. Ruth, at 59, had become a respected figure in the field of elderly care. She wrote a book about her experience titled The Life Seamstress, which became a bestseller and helped raise even more awareness for the cause of abandoned seniors. Her daughter Emily had returned from New York City and worked as a nursing coordinator across several network facilities. The Wilson family had reunited, with Mrs. Dorothy, now 81, living in a small house next to the original home, where she helped in the kitchen whenever she felt up to it. One Tuesday morning, exactly 7 years after the day Victoria had covered Ruth in mud, they met again on the same road where it all began. Now the road was paved, and Victoria had arranged for a covered bus stop with benches so people wouldn't have to wait in the rain anymore. "Ruth, sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday," said Victoria, gazing at the road. "And sometimes it feels like it was another lifetime," Ruth replied. "We're completely different people now." "Do you think Mrs. Eleanor planned all this?" Victoria asked. "I'm sure she did," Ruth smiled. "Your mother was always very clever. She knew exactly what she was doing when she let me take care of her." Victoria laughed. "She managed to bring us together and still create a network of love that reaches hundreds of people. Not every mother can do that." Just then, a bus stopped at the new shelter, and a young woman stepped off carrying a lunchbox. It was Lily, the granddaughter of one of the home's residents, who visited her grandmother every day. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ruth, Mrs. Victoria." Lily greeted politely. "Good afternoon, dear," they both replied. Watching Lily walk toward the home, Victoria and Ruth remembered themselves years ago. Life had come full circle, but now they were on the right side of history. "Ruth, there's something I haven't told you yet," Victoria said, touching her belly. "If my child is a boy, I'll name him William, after my father. But if it's a girl besides Eleanor, I want her middle name to be Ruth." Ruth was moved. "Victoria, you don't have to." "I do. You taught me everything about being a good person. I want my daughter to carry your name so she always remembers the importance of kindness." The two embraced there on the road, where 7 years earlier one had humiliated the other. Now they were family, bound by a love that had grown through forgiveness and transformation. When they arrived at the home, they were greeted by the usual chatter of the elderly. Mrs. Margaret, now one of the group's leaders, was organizing a choir performance for the weekend. Mrs. Ruth, Mrs. Victoria. Mrs. Margaret called, "Come listen to the new song we're rehearsing." The senior choir began singing a song about family, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Victoria and Ruth exchanged a glance and smiled. It was as if Mrs. Eleanor were there, conducting that choir with her endless love. At the end of the day, when all the seniors had retired to their rooms, Victoria and Ruth sat on the porch to talk, as they did every Tuesday. "Ruth, do you believe in fate?" Victoria asked. "I believe in love," Ruth answered. "And when there's real love, it always finds a way, even through the most unlikely circumstances." Victoria smiled and placed a hand on her belly. "I hope I can teach that to my daughter." "You will," Ruth assured her. "Because now you know that true success in life isn't measured by what you can accumulate, but by what you can give." That night, before going to sleep, Victoria wrote in her diary, "Today marks 7 years since the day that changed my life. I've learned that sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what truly matters. Thank you, Mum, for teaching me through Ruth that family is about love, not blood. And thank you, Ruth, for teaching me that forgiving is freeing yourself to love." Ruth in her home was writing a letter to Mrs. Eleanor, as she did every week. "Dear Mrs. Eleanor, your daughter is expecting a baby. She will be a wonderful mother, full of love and kindness. You can be proud. Your mission has been fulfilled. Victoria has learned to love truly." And so, in a small town in upstate New York, 2 women who found each other through pain discovered that true love can transform any situation, no matter how difficult it may seem. The Eleanor Richards Care Network continued to grow, bringing hope and dignity to seniors across the country, proving that small acts of kindness can multiply endlessly when planted in hearts genuinely willing to love. End of story. Now tell me, what did you think of this story of transformation and forgiveness? Did Victoria make the right decision by completely changing her life? And Ruth, did she succeed in showing that forgiveness truly sets you free? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one.